What's up, YouTube? This is True Raw for TV. I think I've talked about him before in a video, but I want to talk about one of my favorite entertainers and comedians growing up in the 90s. Young people may not know. Well, I guess they know who he is just from having seen some of his movies, but I want to talk about Chris Farley. Right, Chris Farley was obviously one of the greatest talents ever to grace Saturday Night Live. He was born in 1964. I think he was born in Madison, Wisconsin. And he has either one or two other brothers that are in the entertainment industry. I think one of them is named Kevin. I think his name is Kevin Farley. He might have another one that's in the entertainment industry. I think his other one, I know he has a brother named Tom, but I don't think he's in the entertainment industry. I know one of them's named Kevin, who's almost a doppelganger for Chris. Like, if you want to see how Chris would look today, look at Kevin, and he looks just like how Chris would look at age 60, which is amazing. That's what Chris would look like if he was alive today. I mean, that's how old he'd be if he was alive today. I think he'd be 59 years old, which is crazy. But he didn't live to comb gray hair. Chris died at the age of 33 of a drug overdose. Although, when the autopsy was done, advanced heart disease played a large role in, his death. And I'll get to that later on. He grew up idolizing John Belushi. But to me, as great a talent as Belushi was, I thought Farley was funnier. Belushi might have been more well-rounded than Farley, but I thought Farley was just generally funnier than John Belushi. But maybe it's a generational thing. Not to say Belushi wasn't funny, but I thought Farley was even funnier. I remember Adam Sandler saying that out of the group of guys that were on that show, Chris was consistently the most funny. And, Adam Sandler used to crack me up, man, because whenever he was in a sketch with Farley, he would always corpse. Corpse means to break character laugh. He would always corpse in those sketches with Chris Farley. Unbeknownst to many of us, we didn't have social media back then, and the only way you would get some of this information if you read tabloid magazines back then, which I really didn't do. But I was not aware in the early to mid 90s that Chris Farley had demons. You obviously could see that the guy liked to eat. He came into the show, when he joined Saturday Night Live, he was already like 250 pounds. So, we already could tell that he's a guy that liked to eat. But I was not aware of the alcoholism. I was not aware of the drug use, which came around the time, I think a little bit before he joined Saturday Night Live. He became a serious drug addict. And I think it was during the 92-93 season, if I'm not mistaken. I think briefly Farley was fired. He was fired briefly, and by Lorne Michaels on Saturday Night Live. And he sort of cleaned himself up briefly. But I think the best thing for Chris Farley, when you look at his life, when you look back at it, was the structure of Saturday Night Live. It was sort of a family structure. It gave him something to do. It occupied his time. He made money, but not that much money. But it gave him some sort of structure. And when Farley got clean, I think it was sometime when he finally got totally clean, at least from alcohol and drugs, I think it was in 1994. And there was like a 2-year window, if I'm not mistaken, where 2 or 2.5 year window where Farley was clean. And it was the best he looked. If you may recall, in Billy Madison, Farley was like, I wouldn't say he was ever thin, but he looked a lot better when he did Billy Madison. And I remember telling someone, on a forum years ago that when he did Billy Madison, he was 225 pounds, and they called me a liar. And it's funny because Tom Farley confirmed in an interview a couple of years ago that when he did Billy Madison, when he was filming it, he was 225 pounds. But when I said it, I was a liar. But yeah, he had got down to 225 pounds. Now, mind you, he was 5'8". But you know, he didn't do drugs or alcohol, but he still did have problems with his weight. But, you know, while he was sober, that's when he did his best work. You know, that's when he did, you know, the cameo with Billy Madison. That's when he did Tommy Boy, which is considered his greatest movie. Black Sheep wasn't that great, but it wasn't bad. You know, that's when he did some of his best work. But the downfall for him, I think, came with Beverly Hills Ninja. By the time he did Beverly Hills Ninja, he had gained a little bit more weight. I think he got back up to like 260, up from 225. But when he did Beverly Hills Ninja, he had put on some weight. And when he saw it, when he looked at the screening of Beverly Hills Ninja, he got so depressed. He hated how he looked. And ultimately, you know, Farley had a relapse. He had done so good at keeping that element out of his life. But, you know, over time, the temptations grew and he got back on drugs. And I think it happened in late 1996 when he relapsed. In 1997, it was a rapid decline in his health. I remember when he was on the Jay Leno show in January of 1997. Twice he was on Jay Leno's show to promote the movie, and after the Packers won the Super Bowl in 97. And I remember that he had problems breathing. He was in such bad shape that he could barely breathe, which was probably a sign of his heart failing him, and maybe fluid in his lungs, which was found during the autopsy. He was definitely starting to show signs of heart disease. And some people say if you watch that interview of him with Jay Leno, that his nose actually started bleeding. And it was apparent that last year of his life he started having nosebleeds. A lot of that came from damage due to cocaine use and hypertension. There was appearance that he made, I think it was in March of 1997 in Aspen, Colorado. It was some sort of Comic-Con event or something like that. I can't remember exactly what the name of the event was, but all of these SNL alums were there. Chevy Chase, I think Jane Curtin might have been there. You know, all of the some of the notable former SNL members and the current ones was there. And Farley was there. And Farley was obviously high as hell. And I think Jan Hooks was there. And Jan Hooks had like a white, if I remember correctly, she had a white like suit coat on or something. Now remember, this is March of 1997. So it wasn't warm. And it was air conditioned in the room, in the building that we're in. Farley was complaining about how hot it was. And he was sweating profusely. He was sweating so much. He was sitting next to Jan Hooks. He was sweating so much that some of his sweat was getting on her and staining her outfit. That's how much he was sweating. That's probably another sign of heart disease. Fast forward to September. And the Inquirer, if I'm not mistaken, I think the National Enquirer came out with a magazine that said Chris Farley on the brink of disaster. And they were talking about how there were insiders that were saying that, man, you know, Chris Farley's in a really bad way. You know, like with the drugs, with the alcohol, with the overeating. When he was filming the movie Almost Heroes with Matthew Perry, Matthew Perry at the time was dealing with a prescription drug addiction, which caused him to lose 30 pounds during the filming of that movie, whereas Chris Farley gained 40 pounds. As a matter of fact, if you look at Almost Heroes, you'll see there are scenes where Matthew Perry looks thinner, and there are scenes where Farley looks heavier. That's because they actually had a break in the filming. And Matthew Perry came back 30 pounds lighter, Farley 40, 50 pounds heavier. But man, I remember that magazine was saying, one guy was quoted as saying, I don't know if Farley's going to last a year. He's burning the candle at both ends at that rate. And then in October of 1997, October 25th, I think it was, he hosted Saturday Night Live, and it was an unmitigated disaster. His voice was hoarse. He had no energy. He couldn't breathe. He was laboring through sketches. There was an oxygen machine on set, so he could breathe into it, because there was fears he was going to have a heart attack on set. They were afraid that, he may even get through the show. There was that fear that he would have a heart attack. So fast forward to the end of the year, man, the Christmas holiday, and he's going on an epic bender in Chicago. And one person was at a bar, was quoted as saying it was seeing Farley drinking alcohol, the alcohol pouring out down the side of his face. He was drinking it so fast. And the way that he was drinking and eating, and one of the guys said, man, this guy's going to kill himself in a week, the way that he was eating, which was very prescient words, So the last few days of his life, he wasn't sleeping. He was just pretty much getting high. He wasn't even drinking alcohol the last several days. He was just getting high on cocaine, snorting. And the last day of his life, the last hours of his life, he was with a hooker named Heidi. I think her name was Heidi, if I'm not mistaken. And she was a companion of his the last several weeks, or not months, of his life. And there are some photos of him with her the last hours of his life. Matter of fact, she even took a picture of him after he collapsed, when he was still alive. And this bender with Farley lasted until the wee hours of December 18th, 1997. Farley was supposed to pay her for her services. He hadn't paid her yet, so she left. By the time she was ready to leave, it might have been around 2:00 in the morning, Farley was starting to experience the effects of the overdose. He was starting to have problems breathing, and she thought that maybe he just needed to, according to her account, that, he would just sleep or whatever, and whatever was going on would clear itself up. According to her, his last words were, "Please don't leave me." And he collapsed. She thought that he fell asleep. And that's when she took the picture, which you might be able to find on the internet. But be careful, because there are some post-mortem photos of Farley that you may not want to see. They're floating around. She took a picture and left. And according to what I've read, the last hours of Farley's life were extremely painful and horrible. As he was overdosing, his heart had to be racing, had to be pounding in his chest, while at the same time his respiration was slowing down due to the speedball. The cocaine was speeding his heart up. The heroin was slowing down his breathing, which led to a massive heart attack. Farley was also beginning to bleed out of his nose, maybe even his ears. I don't know about his ears, but he's bleeding out of his nose. That's why he was found with tissues around him. And it had to be an agonizing death. And approximately 5 a.m. to 5:30 p.m., Christopher Cross Farley died at the age of 33. Sometime around that time period, he died alone. He wasn't to be discovered until probably 7 or 8 hours later. By that point in time, he was already starting to show some signs of decomposition, discoloring. His brother Tom found him. He was near the doorway. And I still believe to this day, had Heidi just called the ambulance, maybe he could have been saved. I don't know. But this, to me, one of the saddest, it was the saddest death in Hollywood history. Even sadder than Belushi's. He didn't deserve to go out like that. He was a nice guy. He was a good guy. And he was surrounded by some very, very evil, nasty people who didn't care about him, only wanted to get high, only wanted to use him for his money. You know. And one of the saddest things I saw was that they said that at age 33, he probably would have needed a heart operation. Had he not overdosed, he probably would have had a heart attack in the next year and needed a triple bypass. That's how much he damaged his body in just 33 years. But anyway, rest in peace, Chris Farley.